Good evening, and thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Kyle Richter, the Executive Director of the Lake Hopatcong Foundation. The Lake Hopatcong Foundation is a nonprofit organization that dedicates itself to protecting the lake environment and enhancing the lake experience, bringing together public and private resources to encourage a culture of sustainability and stewardship on and around New Jersey's largest lake for this and future generations. We are excited this evening to have Dr. Fred Lubnow, the Senior Technical Director of Ecological Services at Princeton Hydro, with us this evening. Princeton Hydro provides environmental and engineering consulting services for water quality monitoring, HAB mitigation, and stormwater management projects at Lake Hopatcong. Dr. Lubnow's areas of expertise include aquatic and watershed management, restoration ecology, community and ecosystem ecology, and the prevention, identification, and management of harmful algal blooms. As Senior Technical Director of Ecology Services at Princeton Hydro, he manages a variety of lake and watershed restoration projects. This evening, Dr. Lubnow will provide us with a summary of the results of the 2022 Lake Hopatcong Water Quality Report, covering data that has been collected as part of Princeton Hydro's work with the Lake Hopatcong Commission, and he will offer actions homeowners can take to help protect water quality on the lake. As a reminder, if you have questions during this presentation, please place them in the chat and we will cover them at the end. It is now my pleasure to turn the screen over to Dr. Lubnow.
All right, thank you, Kyle, I appreciate that. I am going to share right now. Make sure I get this. Okay, can everyone see that? Excellent, all right. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. Again, my name is Fred Lubnow. I'm with Princeton Hydro, and I'll be providing an update and report on the 2022 water quality of Lake Hopatcong. I'll also be talking a little bit about the projects, both current and future, that the foundation and commission have been working on. And as Kyle mentioned, I'll provide some information and tips on how you can help to protect the lake and its associated resources. So this is an aerial view of Lake Hopatcong and its watershed. 4 municipalities within the watershed, Jefferson, Mount Arlington, Roxbury, and the borough of Hopatcong. And just to give you a quick summary of some of the activities last year. So as Kyle mentioned, we do the standard water quality monitoring. We also do some limited cyanotoxin monitoring. Last year, we completed the harmful algal bloom grant that was awarded to the commission, as well as we completed an assessment of the lake's internal phosphorus load. And I'll describe what that is in a little bit. We're currently working on some projects under an existing non-point source 319 grant. Those projects will be completed by the end of this year. And we've initiated some stream bank stabilization projects under a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant. We completed a beach and park restoration plan for Mount Arlington's beach. Those funds were provided through the New Jersey Highlands Council. Another New Jersey Highlands Council grant was awarded to the Township of Jefferson, where we conducted the first year of some detailed water quality monitoring relative to trout habitat. We did submit some stormwater projects under last year's 319 round of funding. They were not funded, but the commission did receive $1 million under the current lake restoration program. And essentially, I'm just showing this photo to show you that those beach restoration plans really focus on near shore HABs as opposed to the entire management of the lake itself. So going back to the lake restoration grant that was awarded, so the proposed projects to be implemented. Now I say proposed because there's a meeting coming up in early March where the commission and foundation will meet with DEP and we'll get some guidance on what exactly will be able to be funded. But what is proposed for funding is to inactivate the lake's internal phosphorus load. There's some funding there to remove accumulated sediment and debris from select stormwater outfalls in the 4 municipalities. There's some funding for a 2-year biochar program. Biochar is it's burnt wood material that has a high affinity to remove pollutants, primarily phosphorus, from the water. There's a Canada goose reproduction management program, which more than likely will be removed because that was above the $1 million. So that project probably won't be funded under this program. And then the grant also includes some funds for filing the final report and grant and project administration. So to continue with the 2022 activities, both the foundation and the commission submitted for another round specifically of stormwater management grants. And I talked to DEP yesterday, and they expect announcements on those funds in early spring. The foundation put in for a stormwater project, which it would involve a biofiltration rain garden in Jefferson, and the commission put in for some basin retrofits in Roxbury. The township of Roxbury actually submitted 2 scopes of work for Landing Channel to do some engineering and ecological data collection as part of the Highlands Council, which is collecting the data that's going to be needed for some potential sediment reuse and dredging. And then finally, for the 2022 activities, again, another Highlands Council grant was submitted. This is being submitted by Morris County for an aeration feasibility study. So a lot going on around the lake, as well as a lot of potential activities coming up in the near future. I do want to start out by showing this graph. So this is the surface water temperature at the Mid-Lake Station at Lake Hopatcong in July, essentially from the late 80s to last year. And while there's obviously variation, there is a statistically significant increase in surface water temperatures. I mean, this is demonstration of climate change. We're seeing temperatures being warmer. I mean, even this winter has been unusually warm. And this has a direct impact on water quality because the harmful algal blooms, which are caused by cyanobacteria, they prefer warmer water temperatures. So that only exacerbates these harmful algal blooms. So this graph here is showing you long-term data. This graph here is showing you temperature data essentially over the 2022 growing season. And if you note, the red area is extremely warm, the blue area is cooler, and the y-axis is depth. So not surprising, as we go through the growing season, water temperatures in the surface really warm up relative to the deeper waters, and this causes a difference in density, which means the surface waters do not mix with the deep waters. So that separation in temperature results in this graph showing a depletion of dissolved oxygen in the deeper waters, particularly over the summer season. Now, having no oxygen in deeper waters, number one, it obviously affects aquatic life. Fish cannot exist in those what are called anoxic waters, meaning there's no oxygen. But more importantly, when there's no oxygen over the sediments, there's a chemical reaction where phosphorus and iron in the presence of oxygen are bound together. But in the absence of oxygen, that bond breaks and the phosphorus starts to leak and migrate up into the water column. So very frequently what we see in these deeper waters is high concentrations of phosphorus. And phosphorus is that primary limiting nutrient that really sparks the growth of the harmful algal blooms. Now, this graph here is showing you the long-term phosphorus concentrations at the Mid-Lake Station. And I'm just showing this to demonstrate that in the Mid-Lake area, we do see we are below the threshold that we want to be at over the course of the years, that in the Mid-Lake area, we've been fine. And even if we look at all the data, so we have 11 monitoring stations throughout the lakes. And so each of these circles represents all the data for 1 year pulled together. And when you look at surface water temperature, surface water phosphorus, you know, over the years, they have been on the decline. And that makes sense. We've been implementing a wide variety of watershed projects. septic projects. The borough of Hopatcong has been sewering. The harvesting has been removing nutrients. So we have seen this decline in surface water total phosphorus concentrations. However, when we've examined this long-term data, if you look at those deep waters where we run out of oxygen, over the decades, we've actually seen an increase in that deep water phosphorus. That's called internal phosphorus loading. So even though we've been focusing on the watershed and we've been reducing the loads going in, we have seen an increase in deep water concentrations of phosphorus. And through our analysis of the 30-year data, this is absolutely attributed to climate change. Now, having that phosphorus-rich water deep down in the lake, you might think, well, if the algae can't get to it, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is some of the common cyanobacteria that cause the HABs have what are called gas vacuoles. And last year, these were the three most common types of cyanobacteria. So in the upper left, that's called Amphantozomenon. In the upper right, this is called Dolictospermum. And the bottom photomicrograph is showing Cylindrospermopsis. The top two ones, they have the gas vacuoles, which means they can move up and down the water column pretty quickly. So when they collapse those gas vacuoles, they sink to the deeper waters, they can fuel up on all that phosphorus, and then they create those gas vacuoles and make those nasty surface scums we see. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward. So this is showing you long-term chlorophyll A data. Chlorophyll is the photosynthetic pigment that all algae have. So this is all algae, the good algae and the bad algae. And we have seen over the last 10 years or so, we have seen this steady increase. We had a peak of chlorophyll A at the Mid-Lake Station, and then the last 2 years, it has been lower than it was in 2020. Now, the reason why I'm showing that is in direct relation to that is the higher amount of phosphorus we have, we tend to have lower Secchi depths. And a Secchi disc, I'll show you what it looks like shortly, but it's a black and white disc that's lowered into the water. The deeper it goes, the clearer the water. And we definitely see Secchi depths in the mid-lake are generally acceptable at 1 meter or deeper. Usually if your Secchi depth is less than 1 meter and a meter is about 3.3 feet, when it's less than that, that's when people say the water looks scummy, looks bad, I don't want to swim there, I don't want to boat there. So in the mid-lake, we've been seeing some decent conditions. But we all remember 2019. And 2019 is right here. It's this dot here. So this is showing you the June phosphorus concentrations. Each dot represents 11 data points of June. And what happened was a week before the HABs hit in 2019, we happened to be out on the lake sampling. And what we found is this dot here in 2019 was the first time in almost 20 years that the phosphorus concentration in the lake exceeded 0.04. Now, this red bar going across, 0.03, that's what we want the lake to be at or lower. And if you look at like through the 2000s, so the commission formed around 2001, we started implementing projects. We did very aggressive weed harvesting. And if you remember the 2000s, the biggest complaint were the weeds. It's because the water was clear, sunlight hits the sediments, we get a lot of plant growth. So HABs weren't too much of an issue. But what happened was when the recession hit and we weren't implementing as many projects, you can see that, you know, the concentrations were starting to increase. And then once we hit 2019, the lake essentially flipped, that we had this elevated phosphorus concentration early in the growing season. Now, if you look at 2020 and 2021, we've been on a decline. We were slightly above this year, but we didn't hit that 0.04 threshold. So these efforts have been helping. But what happened in 2019, it was a 1-2 punch in that in June, with the way the weather pattern was set up, stormwater and septic leachate was rinsing the watershed, putting those nutrients in, and it triggered the HABs in Hopatcong. But they also triggered HABs in many other lakes throughout New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. But the difference with Hopatcong is once the HABs were there and we had those algae that have the gas vacuoles, then they started taking advantage of that internal phosphorus coming up from the sediments. So at Hopatcong, it was a 1-2 punch that the watershed triggered the HABs, but then the internal phosphorus allowed the HABs to continue. And so now when we look at managing Lake Hopatcong, we're thinking of, okay, number one, we want to take care of the watershed, which means stormwater management, goose control, pet control. It means pumping out your septic systems. It means looking where we can to get sewering, taking care of the watershed. But now we also have to look at the internal phosphorus load as well. So this is what a Secchi disc looks like. And I'm showing this to you because I want to put in context some of the upcoming data I'm going to show you. But like I mentioned, if your Secchi depth is 1 meter, which is about 3.3 feet or greater, that's when most people consider the water acceptable for recreational use. Now, what's really interesting is when you look at the longer term data of Secchi depth at Lake Hopatcong, so I'm showing May, June, and July and the average of those. The first half of the growing season is important because it dictates how much plant growth you're going to get. And before the HABs hit in 2019, we had some pretty good Secchi depths that most of the time they were 2 meters or greater. Once we got the HABs in 2019, the lake flipped in that since then, we've had Secchi depths that rarely hit 2. They're usually less than 2. And what that did is when you look at weed harvesting as sort of a surrogate for how much plant material is out there, before the HABs hit, you can see how many cubic yards of weeds were harvested. It was around, 4,000 cubic yards removed, which, was a decent amount of phosphorus removed, like in the 600s. And for the targeted amount of phosphorus to remove, it was between 8 and 9%, which was a decent amount. In the heyday of harvesting in the 2000s, we could get up to 12% of the phosphorus targeted for removal just through mechanical weed harvesting. But when the HABs hit, you can see what happened, that the amount of plants removed substantially declined. Now, some of this was attributed to COVID, but if you look at 2019 and 2022 and you talk to the operators, we just don't see the amount of plant growth that we did before the HABs hit. And that makes sense because the more algae you have in the water, the less sunlight that can hit the sediments and the less plant growth you have. As weird as this sounds, I would rather have the lake deal with high amounts of plant growth than high amounts of HABs, because the plants, they're more manageable. They don't produce the cyanotoxins. You don't have issues with potential beach closures and economic impacts. Yes, they're a nuisance, and yes, there has to be some management of those plants, but they're much easier to deal with than the HABs. So what we want to do is, with all of our efforts, we want to continue to limit the availability of nutrients in the lake to reduce the amount of algae so we can get that increase in clarity back and have more plants. And this is just showing you some of the Secchi depth summaries from 2022. So in May, all Secchi depths were greater than 1 meter. Again, that's that threshold I talked about. Stations 3, 1, and 10. So 3 is in River Styx Crescent Cove, and 1 and 10 are in the northern end of the lake. I have to say that throughout the whole lake, those are generally the areas where we tend to see the highest amount of algae. So it's in River Styx Crescent Cove and in the northern end. And this data just supports that consistently over the summer season. It's typically where we see the lower water clarity is in River Styx Crescent Cove and that northern end. And then just some additional water quality points. So Station 10, again, in the northern end in Jefferson, we saw some supersaturated conditions, which meant a lot of dissolved oxygen. A lot of dissolved oxygen means there's a lot of photosynthesis going on. And indeed, we saw a lot of chlorophyll A and a lot of total phosphorus at Station 10. Station 3, again, in River Styx Crescent Cove, it had some very high total phosphorus concentrations in chlorophyll A. And we saw that, we saw later in the summer that northern end still having some high, not only chlorophyll A and total phosphorus, but we also saw some high total suspended solids, which is essentially dirt in the water column. So those are the areas that we do tend to focus on in terms of nutrient management and control. I mentioned we do some cyanotoxin monitoring. So last year we monitored for one group of cyanotoxins. They're called microcystins. They tend to be the most common one. And fortunately, during our events, when we were out sampling, we got negative readings. So we have 10 stations. This is just showing you the July data and the August data. And I'll talk a little bit about this, what we're planning to do in 2023, but fortunately, negative values in 2022. And this is a map just showing you where those stations are located. Just very briefly, I want to mention that we did complete the HAB grants. The last few projects associated with the HAB grant were some nearshore aeration projects. So this is just showing you Short Hills where we installed a air curtain system. Outside of the air curtain system, we saw some cyanobacteria accumulating along the shore, where in the area where the air curtain was installed, we did get algae, but we got the good algae. They're called diatoms. They can make the water look brown. But number one, they don't make those nasty surface scums. And number two, they don't produce cyanotoxins. We saw similar results for different types of aeration that we implemented. This is the Lake Forest Yacht Club, where we had a nanobubble system with ozone. And then this is Memorial Beach, where we finished that restoration plan for them. Again, you can see the water looks brown. This is what we see generally with these nearshore aeration systems. It doesn't eliminate algae. It just shifts it so that the good algae dominate as opposed to the bad algae. And then to wrap up the HAB grant, we did work, with the commission and foundation. We installed floating wetland islands. We reinstalled some in Ashley Cove, but then also we installed, as part of the 319 grant, some in the southern end of Landing Channel. And again, these floating wetland islands, one 250 square foot island can remove about 10 pounds of phosphorus. 1 pound of phosphorus has the potential to generate up to 1,100 pounds of wet algae goo. We also, I mentioned, working with the Knee Deep Club, we did some detailed monitoring as part of a trout study for Lake Hopatcong. And this report is actually going to be discussed and submitted next week, but I just thought I'd just share some of the data. So this carryover trout habitat, this is just showing you the parameters associated with that relative to temperature and dissolved oxygen. And what's interesting, what we found was, so if you look at the mid-lake data, something we never saw before because we weren't sampling at such a high frequency is that this habitat sort of forms and disappears. So if you look at the meters here, anything less than 1 essentially means there's very little habitat. So this 0.45, very little carryover habitat. And then once we got into like mid-August, no habitat. This is something we don't know if this is something that commonly happens at Hopatcong because this is the first year we've done this, or if this is something that is attributed to climate change. So we are, I submitted a request to the Highlands Council to see if we can do some additional monitoring this year to see if this is something that is more routine, that's something that is going to occur more frequently at the lake. And if so, some of our management efforts need to take that into consideration. We also looked at nearshore areas as well as potential refuge for the trout. And unfortunately, again, when we look at the data from last year, so this is essentially July and August, and any of the dots above this 0 indicates that the nearshore habitat the temperature was warmer than it was at the deep station. My understanding, talking to Pat Rose, one of our project managers, this sampling here was some of the sampling that was done with the Knee Deep Club for some streams. So it makes sense that the streams were cooler than the lake, but the fact that we really didn't have any nearshore habitat is, problematic. But again, this is only 1 year of data, not even 1 year. It's a few months over the summer. What we really need to do is repeat that this year, and we're hoping to do that with funding through the Highlands Council. Again, to see if this is something that was unusual because of the very dry and hot conditions we saw in the late summer, or is this something that we can expect that's going to be more routine in Lake Hopatcong? So as part of the monitoring, we've recommended some modifications. One is we'd like to add a new sampling station in Landing Channel. So there's a lot of activities going on in Landing Channel. We want to make sure that we're routinely monitoring that station. The fact that the northern end, that station 10, we've been seeing some real problems in terms of high phosphorus, high chlorophyll A. So we'd like to do some phytoplankton cell counts to identify what algae are up there. And also, we're going to start using our handheld meters to measure a supplemental pigment called phycocyanin that the HABs, the cyanobacteria, almost exclusively produce. And so we'll be using methodology similar to what the volunteers have been using at the lake. So volunteers from the Musconetcong Watershed Association have been using these meters, collecting a lot of good data and high frequency data. So we're going to continue that on our end, and we're going to start routinely collecting that data as well. Some of the other modifications we're going to do is for the cyanotoxin monitoring. So instead of collecting the data from the lake in a boat, we're going to collect the samples directly from the beach. And I went to a conference last year with HABs, and hearing how some of the federal agencies collect data for HABs, we'll get a lot more useful information if we're collecting right from the beach area. The other thing too, to be perfectly honest, it helps to keep the cost down, because if we have our boat in the lake, we need at least 2 staff members. If we have someone collecting from the beach, you only need 1 scientist, and you don't need the boat. But we are adding another cyanotoxin. So microcystins is the most common group, but we're going to add anatoxin A. Anatoxin A can be a potent neurotoxin, and it's produced by benthic or mat algae. We'd like to grab samples for that analysis as well. If you hear of a dog dying because of eating mats of algae or ingesting algae, and it's a quick death, more than likely it's because of anatoxin A. So we want to start monitoring for that. And then the microcystins, which is the most common one, that one tends to be associated with the surface scum one. So we're going to really be monitoring both of them. And just to let you know, microcystin actually requires quite a bit of nitrogen for its production. So, I'm getting toward the end of this, and the thing I want to put in everyone's ear is we focus so much on phosphorus, and phosphorus is really what drives the productivity and drives the development of these HABs. So we do focus quite a lot on phosphorus, but nitrogen is pretty important as well, because like I said, some of these cyanotoxins need nitrogen to form, for the algae to form these molecules. So what does that mean? Well, that means management efforts such as, septic management, pumping out your system, once every 3 years. Green infrastructure, anything you can do on your property to make sure that the soil is being retained by vegetation goes a long way. Not only to retain the nutrients and function as a sink for nutrients, but also if along your shoreline, if you have stretches of shoreline that are not used as beach or as a dock, if you can plant vegetation immediately along that shoreline, or at least let the vegetation grow as high as your knee, that makes your property less attractive to geese, and geese produce a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen. So, septic management, green infrastructure. I know some property owners have actually, worked with the commission and Rutgers to install rain gardens, which is a great way of treating the runoff on your property and making sure that those nutrients aren't going into the lake, but they're going into attractive vegetation on your property. That goes a long way to remove that nitrogen and phosphorus. And we've been playing with biochar, it's that processed wood material. It's great for phosphorus, particularly in a lake setting. We know nothing about how effective it is with nitrogen. When I look at the literature, it says it's not as great for nitrogen as it is for phosphorus. However, we've been talking with a few vendors who sell biochar that have a, quote, special blend that's good for nitrogen, E. coli, and fecal coliform. So we would like to work with some of those vendors and try their product to see if what they're saying is true. Can we get higher nitrogen removal rates? But like I said, at Hopatcong, we've almost exclusively been focusing on phosphorus. So again, we do want to look at both. The other thing too, I've been seeing a lot of literature lately saying that, you know, if you want to trigger cyanobacteria to produce microcystins, give them a pulse of nutrients. So that's something to keep in mind. If all of a sudden a bag of fertilizer goes right in, that pulse could not only trigger a bloom, but it can trigger the cyanobacteria to produce cyanotoxins such as microcystins. And then the last thing I want to wrap up with is something else that I've been hearing a lot about is how the resting spores, the aconites, can really drive these HABs. And I'll give you an example. There's a lake in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, Harvey's Lake, very low phosphorus concentrations. We've been working with them for over 15 years. We've got a lot of stormwater projects installed. We got they were actually taken off their impaired list because we got the phosphorus low. And then all of a sudden in mid October of last year, they had a HAB event. And it was weird because there was no big rain event. We sampled for phosphorus. It was less than 0.01 milligram per liter, but some of the literature showing that these aconites hang out at the bottom. And if they can get up to the surface, if there's some wind and wave action, and if conditions are right, they can hatch. And we're thinking that may have happened at Harvey's. So we're just starting to think about this at Lake Hopatcong. And so I want to go back to that internal load thing. You know, another way of dealing with the internal load is some type of aeration, which is why we were submitting for a grant to do that aeration feasibility study with Morris County, because not only can the aeration, would it lock that internal phosphorus load up, but it could also help with the trout habitat. And in addition to that, there's been studies to show that supersaturating the water right over those sediments helps to oxidize those aconites. And those aconites, that's an aconite. So it's a larger, tends to be a darker cell. It's basically a resting spore. So when you hit the winter and the cyanobacteria die, these aconites sink into the sediments. And then when you hit spring, the lake mixes and it can stimulate those HABs. This is where they come from these aconites. So again, one of the things we want to look into with this aeration feasibility study is, will we be able to knock down the viability of these aconites by supersaturating those sediments? So I know there was a lot going on, but thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. We have some great questions. Very informative as always. We do have a couple of questions if you have a few more minutes to
absolutely
share knowledge and expertise with us. Cliff London, he's one of our HAB volunteer monitoring. He asked, with the warm winter and lack of ice cover, do you have any predictions, Fred, for HABs or weeds in 2023?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I am concerned that, believe me, I'm not a big fan of cold winters, but I am concerned when we don't have ice cover and we don't have snow on top of the ice. Like we've been monitoring Lake Mohawk as long as we've been monitoring Hopatcong, and we've seen it at Mohawk where we have thin ice or no ice. The following growing season, we have a lot more of the curly leaf pondweed coming up, which is an invasive plant that likes colder conditions, but it can persist into July. Now, what's interesting with Hopatcong is curly leaf pondweed is usually not a major plant in Lake Hopatcong, although last year we did see sizable amounts of curly leaf pondweed in the first half of the growing season. So I am concerned. Now, like I said, the water clarity at Hopatcong since 2009 has not been as great as it was before the HABs, but a mild winter only allows both the cyanobacteria and the aquatic vegetation to grow sooner and be more robust. So yeah, we're going to keep an eye on things, but I am concerned about this very mild winter. Thing is March is always a wild card, so maybe we'll get lucky and have a decent cold March.
And we have some great water clarity right now on Lake Hopatcong. I mean, it is very clear. So
Yeah.
that's probably going to add into the mix as well.
Yeah.
We have a question from Kelly asking if you have any data in King Cove.
So we have in situ data in King Cove. We don't collect water samples, but we do have in situ data. So a lot of the temperature and dissolved oxygen data that we've collected, both as the routine monitoring as well as the trout monitoring, King Cove essentially functions like the rest of the lake when it comes to temperature and DO. I know in general, we haven't seen huge HABs in King Cove the way we have in, say, River Styx, Crescent Cove, but we do have some in situ and some water clarity data with Secchi depth there.
And that's been a long time monitoring station, so that we do have that data going back for quite some time.
Yep.
Okay. Rob Bond is asking, are these stations different than the NJDEP monitoring buoys? And I'm not sure if Rob was talking about the stations that you do the HAB monitoring. So Rob, if you want to just unmute yourself real quick, or were you referring to when Fred was talking about the different projects that we've implemented to address HABs?
Yeah, I think it was HAB related. Whenever you were talking about station numbers, that's my question. Yeah.
Yeah, the station numbers we have are essentially the same numbers that we've been using since the original phase 1 diagnostic feasibility study back in the early 80s. I know when the HABs hit and DEP came up to the lake, they started using ours, but then they modified it because they were adding additional stations. So where we collect our routine monitoring is, mid-lake tends to be 11 different stations. Those are the ones that they're the same stations we've been doing for over 30 years. Then the near shore HAB stations that we use, we've been doing that for maybe 5 years now. They're different than the buoy stations that DEP uses.
And we have one other question. I'm just going to jump ahead from Rob. When you were talking about using the fluorometers, do you have any plans for where you'll be using them at and what frequency you'll be doing that? Because as you know, you do have the data from our volunteers. So will you be doing different sites, or do you have a tentative plan?
Yeah, we're essentially going to be using the fluorometers every time we're out doing our routine monitoring. And when we're doing our cyanotoxin monitoring. So they're in general different stations. Then the volunteers, they collect a lot of good data, and they collect high frequency data. So it is very useful in terms of, and they feed that information, not only to the foundation, but to us. And so it's real valuable. So we're just doing it just to supplement that data. And for us, we're already out there. It literally costs us nothing, just to dunk the meter. And those meters are really great. They're real resilient. They keep their calibration. We have the little meters, and then we have a big expensive meter. And believe it or not, the little meter that's so much more inexpensive tends to be a lot more sturdy and robust as opposed to the real sensitive, expensive meter. So we're doing it to supplement so we have more information.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Doug Sladen. Asking, and I believe you addressed this, Fred. He was asking about the aeration systems, why we can't have one around the lake. And you did mention that, there is a request going into the Highlands Council to do a feasibility study for an aeration system. So could you just talk a little bit more about what's on track for that?
Sure, yeah. So I know there's been talk of aeration, and some of the talk was to have a system that completely mixes, destrats the lake. So remember, I showed those differences in temperature. And the idea was if we completely mix the water column, it will keep the bottom waters oxygenated. Then we don't have to worry about the internal load, which could work depending on the system. But what we're concerned about is if you're going to mix that whole water column, you may eliminate the trout habitat. So that's why we're doing the feasibility study. There are other aeration techniques that you can implement that would allow you to oxygenate those deeper waters, but keep the system stratified so we could have some decent carryover trout habitat. That's what the feasibility study is going to do. The other thing too is, I mentioned this, and this is something that's fairly new, is we're looking into, this stratified, not aeration, but oxygenation, where we'd actually generate oxygen and pump it in. And again, that's to eliminate those, make those aconites less viable. So not only locking in the internal phosphorus, preserving the trout habitat, but also reducing those aconites. So that's why we're doing the study. Now, just to let you know, Culver Lake actually just installed an oxygenation system. And so we work closely with Steve Souza. Steve is their consultant. We do the water quality monitoring for them. So it's going to be interesting because it went in last year. So we're going to have this year, we'll be able to evaluate how that system operates at Culver. So that's the type of technology, but we need to do this study to determine how much oxygen you would need, to keep that system saturated.
Okay, thank you, Fred. I just have, before we go back to the chat, I just had a question that we had from someone that couldn't be with us this evening. They wanted to know if you could talk about what was the most important takeaways from this year's water quality monitoring. What would that be for Princeton Hydro, for you?
Okay. So a couple things. One is, we saw the lake held its own, but two things. Number one is seeing how water clarity hasn't improved since 2019. The fact that even though conditions aren't as bad as 2019, the fact that clarity in general has not improved, and the fact that we're not getting more plant growth, because when you do have more plant growth, there's that competition for light. And like I said, I would rather have us have to manage plants than algae. So looking at that 6 or 7 years of data this year, now that we have that data, seeing how clarity has not improved yet, that was telling. And then the other thing is, and it's not directly related to our long-term monitoring, but the fact of the trout study that, in the past, because we only sampled once a month, 5 times between May and September, we always just assumed, well, we lose the trout habitat at one point, and then we gain it back when temperatures go down. Here we actually we saw it like form and disappear, like this flip-flop, which we weren't expecting. And that's why we would like to continue that high frequency monitoring to see, was that unusual, or is that something that we should expect to occur on a more routine basis?
Thank you, Fred. And I see that Rob Bond has another question that he'd like to make. Rob, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Fred, is Princeton Hydro involved with assessing the nano bubbler program that's going on in Crescent Cove? And if so, are you at liberty to say anything about that?
So I am familiar with the nanobubble systems that were installed as part of the HAB grant. So, we did 3 nearshore projects. We did the air curtain at Shore Hills, and then we did the one at the Yacht Club, which is a nanobubble system, and the one at Memorial Beach in Mount Arlington. I am not familiar with the system that is in River Styx Crescent Cove.
Can you say anything generally about the effectiveness of the technology as a whole?
Of nanobubble systems, or the system that's nanobubble. So again, we've only, it's a relatively new technology for lake management. And so we've only installed these 2 systems. And I have to say, these 2 systems as nearshore systems, they seem to be effective. Like I said, we saw this flip we went from bad algae to good algae, this nearshore system. Now we are looking at different ways of using nanobubble technology, more of a mobile system. And we're talking to some companies about using it in a large scale basis. But how we used it at Lake Hopatcong, I saw it work and be effective, at least for the year that we did the monitoring.
Thank you.
Yep.
And then there is a comment from Cliff London about aeration done in Round Valley, and I'll be sure to share that with you, Fred. But I'd like to ask my colleague, Caitlin Duran, has a question she'd like to put forth to you, Fred.
Okay.
I'm just trying to be proactive, Fred, because I find this warm spell just very eerie for me. I've been struggling with the whole climate change issue, which feels massive. So I'm wondering, because what I'm hearing from you is that climate change has led to an observable difference in conditions on Lake Hopatcong. Is there anything we in this chat, that individuals can do to be proactive in reversing these warming trends? Does it just start with being informed and attending presentations like this? What's something I can do?
Yeah, and so there's the large scale issues with climate change, which try to minimize your carbon footprint relative to HABs. The thing about HABs is they generally need three things. They need higher water temperatures, they love still water conditions, and they love high phosphorus concentrations. Of the three, the temperature, on a local year-to-year basis, you really can't do anything on temperature. The mixing, from a shoreline perspective, that's how the air curtain works, is you're just agitating the water. It's not doing anything magical. It's just preventing that still water condition that those HABs need to make those surface scums to move up and down. So agitating the water, keeping the water circulated helps. But what everyone can really focus on is nutrient control. That's really how we can get a handle on HABs and really limit their growth, is by picking up after your pets, goose management, planting native vegetation wherever you can, rain gardens, making sure that municipalities are cleaning infrastructure. The municipalities are working very hard with the commission and foundation to get projects in the ground that not only deal with stormwater, but also treat the stormwater to remove nutrients, pumping out septic systems. Jefferson is reevaluating the possibility of sewering their portion of the watershed, which, Marty's asked me, if you could do one thing, to really have a big impact on Lake Hopatcong, what would it be? And I always say, if you could get Jefferson sewered, that would have a huge impact on reducing the availability of nutrients. So those efforts are really, on a short-term basis, what we can really focus on.
Thank you, Fred. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Caitlin. So before I turn it back over to Kyle, our executive director, I just have two quick questions. Cliff is asking about the trout and if you know the actual holdover rate in terms of holdover fish caught. I don't know if you have that data available. If not, we can, certainly get that to Cliff.
Yeah, so the Knee Deep Club, that's sort of part of what we were doing with the Highlands Council grant, was we were collecting data, and the Knee Deep Club has been working with the commission and foundation to do a trout study to document that carryover of the trout. So, we're only 1 year into it, so we have very preliminary data. I do know the Trout Committee, and again, Pat Rose, one of our project managers, and Paul Cooper, one of our technical project managers, they've been meeting routinely with the Trout Committee. We're submitting our report to them, and I know they're going to discuss it further, but that data, should be readily available fairly soon.
Okay, thank you, Fred. And then one final question from Charles Baker is asking if the 5-year drawdown that's going to be on, and Charles, I'm assuming you're talking about the 5-year drawdown that's happening this summer. Will that help with the HABs? I know in the past it's helped with the reduction of the weeds the following summer after the drawdown. But do you think there'll be any change with the harmful algal blooms?
Yeah, usually I would say no. Now, there might be the possibility of, if you have a drawdown and if you have a cold enough winter, maybe that will help in reducing the viability of those aconites. But those aconites are pretty tough. And so most studies show that when you do that winter drawdown, it really doesn't have an effect on HABs. Now, if for some reason you couldn't get the water level back up, that might impact the HABs, that you're not having flushing go through the lake, because again, you'd have that still water condition. But yeah, the drawdowns in general during the winter really do not have an impact one way or another on the HABs. And on the plants, it only really has an impact on the plants if you have a good cold weather, you know, a good like 30 days of good cold weather exposing those sediments, you can actually have a decent amount of plant control. But that, you know, if you look at this winter, if there was a drawdown this year, it would have no impact on the plants.
Well, Kyle, I'll turn it back over to you if you have any other questions or comments. Thank you again, Fred. It's always a pleasure.
Yep, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred, for a great presentation. I learned a lot. This is the second time I've listened to the presentation, but you learn something new every time. And I want to thank everyone for giving up an hour of your evening to come learn a little bit more about, I think I can safely say, everyone on here's favorite lake. I just want to let everybody know to be on the lookout for information coming out on our next program, which will happen this spring on April 13th, entitled Eco-Friendly Landscape Design. So hopefully we can learn a little bit more about putting some of those things Fred has mentioned into practice around Lake Hopatcong. In the meantime, if you have any questions on anything, please feel free to reach out to us at the foundation. You can visit our website, lakehopatcongfoundation.org, or send us an email to info@lakehopatcongfoundation.org. And we look forward to seeing you around the lake sometime this spring and summer. Hope everybody has a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.